So one of the things we should always keep in mind, remember, is that in Plato's dialogue, where the vast majority of them, Socrates is the main character, that not only was Socrates a real person, but most of the characters that he speaks with in the dialogues are based on real people that Plato knew. Whether or not any one of the discussions that takes place in Plato's dialogues is an accurate reflection of a real discussion that actually took place, no one knows. But it's good to keep in mind that these are real people talking to each other, and oftentimes the discussion takes place in public, in Athens, the city of Athens. And sometimes things happen in the dialogue make us realize that there are other people around who aren't speaking. They're just sort of watching Socrates and this other person, sometimes more than one person, have a philosophical discussion, listening to what's going on. And that happens in this dialogue when Socrates pulls out this little boy that's part of Meno's retinue, let's say. I mean, Meno is a nobleman from northern Greece, in this place called Thessaly, which is apparently kind of a rural district, so he's kind of a hick. Is that okay to say? He's a country boy in the big city of Athens, but he's a rich one, and he's brought his people with him, one of whom is his slave. I mean, typical wealthy Greek man of the time, he owned slaves. And this next part of the dialogue, second part of the dialogue, is really taken up with Socrates' encounter, or what one might say the slave boy's encounter with Socrates. And why does he pick him out? Well, he picks him out and asks some questions because as a slave, as Meno says, born in his house, we can be sure that he has had no prior instruction in mathematics, which Meno confirms. And what does Socrates do with him? Well, that's really for you to describe. He goes through a very basic problem in geometry, which I wrote a note about. It's actually not only easy to follow, but it brings up some very interesting issues in geometry and the Greek development of formal mathematics, having to do with the relationship between the side and diagonal of a square. The question that he's exploring with the slave boy is if you have a square of a certain area, and then you want you want to find the side of a square that is double the area of the square that you started with. What is that side? That brings up some pretty interesting issues involving irrational or incommensurable magnitudes and irrational numbers, I guess. And if you look at the solution that they find, has some pretty obvious implications for the Pythagorean theorem. So it's pretty interesting. Obviously, it's not a class in mathematics, nor am I good at mathematics. I'm terrible at mathematics, actually. But even I can follow, after years of reading this dialogue, even I can follow, I think, the math. But that's not what's really important for us. So what is he trying to prove? I mean, he is claiming that he is only asking questions of the slave boy, that he's not teaching him anything, that he's helping him to recollect what he already knows. And if we go by literally what Socrates has said in the beginning of this section, in the 81D, 81C, things that he has learned when he was not yet a human being. That notion that the soul is immortal, it's existed forever, it's already learned all things. And all we need to do now is to recollect what we already knew, what our souls have already discovered in our past lives or in the time when we were not human beings, etc. And then so inquiry is possible. And that is certainly what, on the face of it, he's trying to do with the slave boy, is to show that the slave boy, who starts out not knowing about the relationship between the side and diagonal of the square, not knowing how to figure out what the side of a square of double the area is, and he eventually understands it. He eventually, he knows it, and this is a this is an example of the kind of thing that Socrates is interested in. How do we go from ignorance to knowledge? We see it happening with the slave boy. What he seems to be telling Meno is, look, he can do it with mathematics. He can do it with this problem in geometry. Why can't we do it with regard to virtue? Now, whether or not he is actually demonstrating that knowledge is recollection, that's a critical point, and that's a shaky point, and he himself admits that that's a shaky point. And if we look all the way at the end of this section 2, on page 20 at 86c, Socrates says, I do not insist that my argument is right in all other respects. And that argument, I presume that he's referring to his argument that knowledge is recollection. He continues, but I would contend at all costs, both in word and deed, as far as I could, that we will be better men, braver and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the things one does not know, rather than if we believe that it is not possible to find out what we do not know, and that we must not look for it. Again, is Socrates arguing on a basic theoretical level that inquiry is possible, that Meno's paradox is not a real problem? Or is he arguing on a practical level? Is he saying, well, I don't know if it's true or not, but I believe that we'll be better men, we'll be better human beings if we continue our inquiry into the important things like the nature of virtue, even if we haven't solved the problem of paradox and proved that that inquiry can come to some conclusion in knowledge. What he seems to be saying is that we'll be better if we keep trying. Now that, on the one hand, seems right, because it seems right to do philosophy, because it seems right to constantly inquire into the things that we think we should know. On the other hand, Meno's paradox has dealt a blow, seemingly, to philosophy in saying, well, you don't even know what it means to look for something. Meno's paradox says, if you're completely ignorant about something, then how will you look for it? And even if you find it, how will you know that that was the thing that you were looking for? That is, to my mind, on the face of it, a serious objection to the worth of the philosophical enterprise, which is to gain knowledge. If philosophy can't respond to that objection, to show, logically, rationally, argumentatively why it's wrong, then there's going to be this question about the possibility of finding knowledge. And those questions, frankly, will continue in this course. In a certain sense, they are the questions of this course. How do we go from ignorance to knowledge? How do we know that we know when we know? And if we don't know that we know when we know, do we really know? How about that? So, yes, this is very important, this notion of knowledge is recollection, to think about it, to think about how serious Socrates is in his advocation of this idea that knowledge is recollection. Does it really solve the problems that Meno has brought up in his paradox about inquiry? Does his encounter with the slave boy really prove that knowledge is recollection? Is he really bringing this pre-existent knowledge out of the mind or soul of the slave boy, or is he teaching him in a conventional way? That's, again, for you to decide. And what do we get out of it? Is the paradox really met by the doctrine of recollection? One point about that is that we think about what he has said, that, well, we don't have to worry about the paradox. We don't really learn anything. We just recollect what we've already learned when our souls were not yet human beings. Well, if knowledge or inquiry is impossible, how do we first learn these things, even if we weren't yet human beings and our souls were free? I mean, if Meno's paradox objection is a good one, how do we learn things in the first place so that we could recollect them later? There's all sorts of questions that are raised. So now we'll move on, though. We've raised the issues, we've raised the questions. Let's move on to the third part of the dialogue.